Coming to our panel discussion, Saving Higher Education from Cancel Culture, sponsored by the Legal Insurrection Foundation. My name is Kimberly Kay, and I am the Director of Operations and Editorial Development for the Legal Insurrection Foundation, and I'm also the Senior Contributing Editor for Legal Insurrection, the blog. And I'll be hosting and moderating this fabulous panel that we have before us this evening. Tonight we have a panel discussion that I'm incredibly excited about, but before we get started, there are just a handful of housekeeping things I'd like to go over. First, please remember that each panelist is here of their own accord, and the opinions of the speakers are theirs alone. They're here in their individual capacities, and the views they express here do not necessarily represent the views of their employers nor the Legal Insurrection Foundation. So what we'll do is we'll introduce cancel culture. We'll have our panelists share their stories, because our panel is made up of 3 survivors of cancel culture. And then we also have a gentleman here who deals with cancel culture and helping to save people who are under the throes of a cancel attack, I guess you would call it, on a daily basis. So we'll start there, and then we'll take questions. So we will be taking questions from y'all. So if you're in attendance, please place your questions in the chat section and be sure to address it to all panelists. Throughout the discussion, I'll be monitoring those, and we'll get to as many questions as we possibly can, time permitting. So just to tell you a little bit about the Legal Insurrection Foundation, we launched in March of 2019. We are a 501c3 tax exempt entity. We hold research events. We deal with in particular free speech issues and college campus issues, of which there are many. And we also do a lot of research, and we hold events. And so since the pandemic, we've had a lot of success doing things online. It's no substitute for meeting you in person, but it's the best we have right now. So we're thankful that everyone is here. We are donor supported. We are teeny tiny. We have a virtual office, so every single dollar that we receive gets put right back into programming like this, so that we can put on panel discussions and educational material, and we can offer that free to the public, like this event. So it's something that we're really proud of doing. You can learn more about us at the Legal Insurrection Foundation website, which is just legalinsurrectionfoundation.org, which is currently being updated. So you'll see more updates there this week. As for the Legal Insurrection blog, it's been around for 12 years. Professor Jacobson, who's also on the panel, is the publisher of the blog and started it 12 years ago. We cover all kinds of things there, but in particular, we cover legal issues, politics, culture, things of that nature. We publish frequently. Both Professor Jacobson and I publish daily. In addition to us, we have a team of fantastic bloggers located all over the country who follow issues judiciously. And we don't just cover a story once and leave it be. We really dig into the weeds, and we follow things throughout, from beginning to end, and dig into things a lot deeper, and uncover things that the media loves to leave out, whether intentionally or out of sheer laziness. So we're there every day. We also have a daily newsletter that's free, and we just include the highlights. You can sign up for that for free, and you can find that at legalinsurrection.com. So as for myself, I graduated from Texas A&M, where I studied history and political science, and I also had the privilege of studying World War II in France. Prior to entering the political world in 2011, I worked at one of the largest immigration law firms in the country, but after getting involved in politics, I've worked with people like James O'Keefe. I worked with Senator Cornyn's re-election campaign, with Americans for Prosperity, Freedom Works, and Freedom Works for America. And when I was doing work with Freedom Works for America, I had the privilege of traveling all over the country to meet with activists from everywhere. And what I can say is that despite what the media would have you believe, this country is vast and gorgeous and beautiful and made up of people who absolutely love it. And just wonderful people on the whole. We're very passionate about the things that they chase because of their love of America. So, and I am married. My husband and I have 3 kids. So when it comes to issues of education, this is one of the only things that keep me up at night, having 3 youngsters. So this is something that's very important to the broader cultural discussion, but also to me personally. So in 2014, I wanted to get back to writing, connected with Professor Jacobson, and I've been with Legal Insurrection since. And so to start off, I think everyone is probably familiar with the term cancel culture. It's permeated every facet of daily life at this point, from politics to higher education, to the tech world, to, I mean, with social media, you follow someone on the street who does something that you don't like, and then all of a sudden there's millions of views and people are calling for your job. It's a problem. And so when I think of cancel culture, there's 2 things that come to mind, I think, that most succinctly describe what it is. And one would be Nick Sandman, the Covington High School teenager who was dealt the full force of cancel everything by every major institution, from Hollywood, from politicians, from the media, and all for standing there while someone was screaming in his face. Right, and he used his spot at the RNC to discuss what it was like to be canceled, and how simply standing there and fighting for yourself becomes a full-on war. And then the other is something that happened very recently, and there was video that was taken in DC where a woman and her friend were sitting at a cafe just enjoying a meal, and the Black Lives Matter protesters come over and they're yelling and screaming within inches of her face, trying to get her to acquiesce and trying to intimidate and threaten her into submission and to supporting a very particular set of ideas. And I mean, this is something, as I mentioned before, that's permeated every single facet of life. So rather than attempt to define cancel culture on my own, I think there's a handful of people who've done it far better than I have. And one of them is Jonathan Rauscher, and he's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he created a cancel culture checklist. And so I'll just kind of briefly touch on that so that we can all be on the same page moving forward. And so he included 6 things that make up cancel culture, because as the panelists can explain to you, one of the most common criticisms when someone is enduring being canceled or an attempt at being canceled is that, oh, well, you just can't take criticism. Well, it's not near that simple. It's far more nuanced, and it's far more maniacal than that. And so Jonathan Rauscher defines it as something that has these 6 tenets. One is punitiveness. Are people denouncing you to your employer, your professional groups, or your social connections? Are you being blacklisted from jobs and social opportunities? And does what is being said about or to you have the goal or foreseeable effect of jeopardizing your livelihood or isolating you socially? The second is deplatforming. Are campaigners attempting to prevent you from publishing your work, giving speeches, or attending meetings? Are they claiming that allowing you to be heard is violence against them or makes them unsafe? And the third is organization. Does criticism appear to be organized and targeted? Are the organizers recruiting others to pile on? Are you being swarmed and brigaded? Are people hunting through your work and scouring social media to find ammunition to use against you? Secondary boycotts. Is there an explicit or implicit threat to people who support you will get the same punitive treatment that you're receiving? Are people putting pressure on employers and professional colleagues to fire you or stop associating with you? Do people who defend you or criticize the campaign against you have to fear adverse consequences? The next is moral grandstanding. Is the tone of the discourse ad hominem, repetitive, ritualistic, posturing, accusatory, and outraged? Are people flattening distinctions, demonizing you, singing inflammatory labels, and engaging in moral one-upmanship? Are people ignoring what you actually say, talking about, but not to you? And then the last is truthiness, as he calls it. Are the things being said about you inaccurate? Do the people saying them not even seem to care about their veracity? Do they feel at liberty to distort your words, ignore corrections, and make false accusations? And so essentially, if the event meets each of these 6 tests, then yes, it is in fact cancel culture. And so I'm Incredibly excited to introduce to you our first panelist, Robert Shibley, who is the Executive Director of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, also known as FIRE. He's a native of Toledo, Ohio, and a graduate of Duke University and Duke University School of Law. Robert is the author of Twisting Title IX from Encounter Books. And during his 15-year career at FIRE, Robert has aided students and faculty members at hundreds of colleges and universities and personally traveled to dozens of campuses to educate students, faculty, and administrators about First Amendment issues. A free speech activist who himself faced campus censorship, Robert's writing has appeared in many national publications, including the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Washington Post, and Time. He's also represented FIRE on NPR, The O'Reilly Factor, CNN Tonight, Tucker Carlson Tonight, Stossel, Fox and Friends, and CNN's Lou Dobbs Tonight, as well as many other national and international television and radio programs. So without further ado, Mr. Shibley.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's great to be here with all of you. And thank you, Professor Jacobson and the Legal Insurrection folks for arranging all of this. I'm really excited to see how many folks have come out for this. I'll try to be brief, and I know we're going to get more deeply into cancel culture stuff, but I want to introduce it by saying that the problem of cancel culture on campus is one of the more intractable problems we've faced with regard to free speech on campus in FIRE's 21 years. When I began at FIRE 17 years ago this week, and then for many years afterwards, students were by far the most reliable supporters of free speech on college campuses. I remember back in my early years of FIRE, students at Texas Tech even held a funeral for free speech after Texas Tech passed a speech code in the early 2000s. It was complete with pallbearers carrying around a wooden Dracula-style coffin. And unfortunately, that has changed. And in the last few years, students have seemingly changed from a very pro-free speech constituency, realizing it's their rights, to one that, if you can judge by the most vocal of them, and I don't know that you can, is nearly as hostile to unfettered free speech on campus as are campus administrators. Here's a I think it's hard to know the scale exactly, but I can estimate it for you a little bit. In recent years, FIRE has received a total of around 1,000 case submissions through our website annually, where you can go and say my free speech has been violated. And in the single month following George Floyd's death, we received 280 submissions. So more than a quarter of our year's submissions in that single month, or average year. The vast majority of them having to do with students getting in some kind of trouble, whether or not official, for commenting on Floyd, Black Lives Matter, or related issues. And they're still coming in at a higher clip than normal and are actually speeding up again as schools are slowly starting to return to session. What makes this problem even harder to deal with from a free speech perspective, and especially FIRE's perspective, is that the main force scaring students into silence is not administrative sanction, it's social sanction. I think that's in many cases true for faculty as well, although I think it comes through in a professional way more profoundly for faculty members who are being piled on by their colleagues. And here's the thing, most people believe that social sanction is an important tool in how a society self-regulates when it comes to speech. Yeah, there's this assumption that we have fewer Klan members and neo-Nazis than we otherwise would because it's costly to become one, even if you were to agree with it. The problem is that, when we're having these arguments about police treatment of Black Americans, the validity of Black Lives Matter ideology, George Floyd, himself or other people who have had these issues with police, we need to be able to have those arguments some way in a democratic society. And while the vast majority of cancellation activity is not illegal and is indeed protected by free speech law, that doesn't mean it's not a problem. And it does need a lot of these a lot of what amounts to, in the aggregate, a cancellation, that that expression needs to be protected as long as it's not actually defamatory, because if it's not, we're opening the door wide to government interference in every incendiary remark that people make. But nevertheless, it's a huge threat to free speech in our democratic republic as a cultural issue. And that's true even if there's no legal remedy that we can think of, or at least that I can think of, that would turn out that wouldn't turn out to be worse than the disease. John Stuart Mill, who free speech folks love and for good reason, wrote this in On Liberty in 1859. He wrote, "Merely social intolerance kills no one, roots out no opinions, but induces men to disguise them or to abstain from any active effort for their diffusion. Thus is kept up a state of things very satisfactory to some minds, because without the unpleasant process of fining or imprisoning anybody, it maintains all prevailing opinions outwardly undisturbed, while it does not absolutely interdict the exercise of reason by dissenters afflicted with the malady of thought. A convenient plan for having peace in the intellectual world and keeping all things going on therein very much as they do already. But the price paid for this sort of intellectual pacification is the sacrifice of the entire moral courage of the human mind. The sort of men who can be looked for under it are either mere conformers to commonplace or time servers for truth." And I was really struck by this because I think, except for the old-fashioned style of language, this could easily be written in 2020 about cancel culture, social media mobbing, and the sort of personalities that we see come out during this. And so we're going to be talking, what might the solution be? We obviously can't tell people that they, can't or should never criticize others for expressing their racism, nor should we. But we do need a cultural shift in which people are given some room to be wrong, and where our first impulse is to try to convince our opponents rather than destroy them. My own feeling, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, is that we'll get there eventually, but that instead of heeding, this wisdom that we've picked up over the balance of Western society about rationality, instead, we are going to keep shooting at each other and picking up these tools and beating each other with them until so many people have had their lives destroyed, and the folks on this panel can tell you about that everybody finally backs away from the brink because they're exhausted. It kind of reminds me of the end of World War I in a societal way, and I think we can do better. We even have institutions, colleges and universities, as well as K through 12 high schools and elementary schools that could actually train us to save us from this eventuality. But instead, those institutions have spent at least the last 2 generations preparing young people to get involved in the war that we're all reeling from now. And I do think that if they don't stop doing it soon, there will be no saving our society from the really ugly ramifications of where this could go.
Thank you so much, Robert. And again, we're thrilled to have you here. And as Robert mentioned, when we get to the question and answer section, this is not just a thing where we're going to sit around and complain about cancel culture. We're going to talk about how we get past this, how we push back, because that's what you want to know. And it's really important that people know how to engage and know how to push back against this pox on broad culture and pox on ideas that might be out of what some pretend is the mainstream. But to keep moving forward, I'm also pleased to introduce Professor Joshua Katz. And Professor Katz is a Kotzen Professor in the Humanities. He's a professor of classics and a member of the program in linguistics at Princeton University, where he's been on the faculty since 1998. He's a recipient of degrees in linguistics from Yale, Oxford, and Harvard. He's widely published in the languages, literatures, and cultures of the ancient world, from India to Ireland, via Greece, Rome, and the Near East. His scholarship has been honored by numerous national and international organizations, and he's especially proud to have won at Princeton the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching and the Phi Beta Kappa Teaching Award. So without further ado, Professor Katz, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, and good evening, everyone. For the past 22 years at Princeton University, I have taught, with gratifying success, classes that range from ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs to the history of the English language. By nature, a library rat who does not enjoy the spotlight, I have rarely taken public stances on issues of the day. This has not been difficult. After all, the job of professors is to conduct research and teach things in which they are expert, and I am not a specialist in 21st century American sociopolitics. My expertise is in linguistics, in words. But in recent years, and especially recent months, people inside the academy have, with frightening rapidity, persuaded a considerable segment of the populace that words are violence and need to be policed. Even more frightening is that these ideas have been coupled with violent actions and calls for defunding the actual non-metaphorical police. My fellow denizens in the ivory tower are waging a war, and it is no longer advisable for me to retreat fully into the stacks of Princeton's wonderful library. I only wish that I had spoken out sooner. Consider the newly dominant word anti-racism. It sounds attractive, but isn't. In fact, it is a Trojan horse for race-based discrimination of its own kind. On July 4th of this year, a few hundred of my Princeton colleagues promulgated an open letter to the administration with a very long list of requests and demands in the name of anti-racism. We're all getting used to such letters, but this one was a doozy, with a large number of demands that are either widely considered immoral, for example, creating a new faculty committee to investigate research that is regarded as racist and discipline those responsible, or flat out illegal. Giving financial rewards specifically to faculty of color would be a violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I've had enough, and I penned a lone letter of dissent. I believed then, and I believe now, that what I wrote was measured, quite unlike the letter to which I was responding, a document that, as Connor Friedersdorf pointed out earlier this month in The Atlantic, very few signatories are actually willing to stand up and defend. Nonetheless, the backlash was fierce. The president of Princeton issued a personal denunciation. A good number of my colleagues wrote and said scurrilous things about me. For example, that I had deliberately placed colleagues and students at serious risk. The student newspaper flaunted its partisanship. Former students, many of whom owe some of their success to my teaching, advising, and letters of recommendation, made clear that I belonged in the stocks, with some hoping I'd lose my job. And the Princeton administration announced ominously that it would be, quote, looking into the matter further. Most of this was not about my reactions to the more dangerous demands, but rather about a few words I'd written in one paragraph about a defunct student group, which I called a terrorist organization. I stand by my words. Of course, a linguist is as fallible as the next person and sometimes slips up, even with language. But in fact, I chose my blunt words with care. Moreover, I stress that I spoke of no one by name and said nothing about current students. When a university announces that it is looking into a member of the faculty for saying something negative, never mind also accurate, about alumni, something has obviously gone very wrong. Fortunately, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal immediately recognized this and said so. What came of all this is, in one good sense, nothing. The university, in the end, acknowledged that my speech is protected and that I am not being investigated. Still, on a local level, I continue to be the target of unconcealed contempt, though not of legal action, and the coming semester, which begins tomorrow morning, is obviously going to be full of psychological warfare. I do not, however, feel like a victim. I continue to be among the most extraordinarily privileged people in the world. And even some good has come from the presumptive cancellation. The petty politics of local contempt, though awful, is outweighed by the avalanche of support I've received from undergraduates in classics to politicians in Washington, from chemists in California to journalists in Italy, from people incredulous at what is going on in academia to distinguished professors at top-tier institutions in fields that range, yes, from African-American studies to zoology. It is gratifying to be able to say that the support comes from across the political spectrum. I emphasize this both because I consider myself to be a classical liberal, not a conservative, and because I insist that free speech is not an issue of left versus right. It is an American issue. It is arguably the American issue. Outside marginal, though very important exceptions, such as child pornography and incitement to violence, free speech is a bedrock principle. If we cannot agree on this, then we are lost as a nation. So what is to be done? I am not a lawyer and not a policymaker, but I offer some observations. As far as my job is concerned, Princeton University could not have disciplined me for what I wrote. The reason for this is as simple as it is important. In April 2015, Princeton became, by formal vote of the faculty and with the support of the president, the second institution of higher education in the country after the University of Chicago to adopt the so-called Chicago Principles of Free Expression. These same principles are legally enforceable. If you are planning to attend college or to send your children to college somewhere, you may wish to pay special attention to the 75 institutions of higher education that have adopted or endorsed these principles. And if you are a student at or employed by a place that has not done so, I suggest you get to work. That's an institutional comment. But then there's what's most important for the mental health of anyone who walks through a firestorm. You need friends and supporters, people who will criticize but not destroy you when you make a mistake, people who have your back when they believe you're right, though others seek to destroy you. Ideally, they will write strong letters to your administration when it hesitates to do the right thing. I know that Princeton's leadership received many such letters. Ideally, they will express themselves in public fora. It is depressing just how many friends I have lost. But obviously they weren't actually friends. Also depressing is just how many communications I have received from people, including prominent colleagues at Princeton, who say that they wish they could support me publicly, but alas, are afraid of what will happen to them if they do. Still, some people, friends old and new, have stepped up to the plate, and I will be forever especially grateful to them. Standing up to the mob is psychologically hugely stressful. Take it from someone who does not have a naturally thick skin. But if you know that you are not alone, as I thank God did and do know, it helps a lot. A friend, as I have just hinted, is someone who criticizes but does not destroy you when you make a mistake. I expect we can all agree that when one makes an error, it is appropriate to apologize. But these days, pretty much anything that goes even mildly against the reigning and increasingly radical and bizarre orthodoxy can lead to cancellation. Use a wrong word, say. The pressure to apologize in an effort to appease one's tormentors can be tremendous. But do not give in to the pressure. If you feel you did no wrong, do not apologize. I have watched people abase themselves before the mob in an effort to receive mercy for what should at most be a misdemeanor and be mocked for it, for there is no redemption in the new woke religion. Also important is to be consistent. As you may know, about a month ago, Jesse Goldberg, a scholar of American literature recently hired by Auburn University, tweeted on his private account, "Fuck every single cop, every single one." This and other comments he has made suggest that Dr. Goldberg and I are not likely to become best buddies. But for Auburn to have condemned him for expressing his view, as it did, is just as anathema as Princeton's condemnation of me for expressing mine. Freedom of expression means just that. The remedy for speech you don't like is more speech. Let me close by recommending Czesław Miłosz's 1953 work, The Captive Mind. If you have not read it, you should. And if you have read it, this is a good time to pick it up again. It is a good time because we are in a bad time. The book is a devastating portrayal of why intellectuals are sometimes moved to embrace totalitarianism and, based on Miłosz's experience in Stalinist Poland, what the results can be when they do. On this subject, I also commend to you two recent pieces in Quillette by the distinguished Princeton mathematician Sergiu Kleinerman, who left communist Romania in the 1970s. One is titled, "Princeton University is one of the least racist institutions in the world." The other laments what has become of the wonderful American system to which he and other academics from repressive countries fled. The second one closes with a rallying cry from the Three Musketeers. "We can start," Kleinerman writes, "by defending each other based on the principle that a woke attack on one is an attack on all." My colleague is correct that we must band together defensively, but we must also not be afraid to play offense. The majority of Americans loathe cancel culture. It is time to stop being afraid to express, over and over again, and in as many public ways as possible, our collective disgust at the shocking illiberalism that has taken over the minds of a highly vocal, often extraordinarily privileged minority of our citizens. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Katz. That was outstanding. And so I'm going to go to our next panelist. This is Professor Jason Hill. And Professor Hill is a professor of philosophy at DePaul University, where he's also an honors distinguished faculty. His areas of specialization are in ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of psychology, and American politics and foreign policy. He's a senior Shulman Journalism Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Professor Hill, is the author of the best-selling book, We Have Overcome, An Immigrant's Letter to the American People, which is published by Bombardier Books in 2018, as well as 3 acclaimed trade academic books, Civil Disobedience and the Politics of Identity, When We Should Not Get Along, Beyond Blood, Identities, Post-Humanity in the 21st Century, Becoming a Cosmopolitan, What It Means to Be a Human Being in the New Millennium. He is the host of the radio show Into the Gap on WCGO Radio in Chicago. And Professor Hill is a recipient of several leadership awards, and you can learn more about him. His website is jasondamianhill.com. So without further ado, Professor Hill.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. And thank you, Professor Jacobson, for arranging this most auspicious event. I'll try to be very brief and just sort of enlighten people about my situation, which has been in the media for a number of years. In 2000, well, for the past year and a half, actually, in 2019, I wrote an article in The Federalist called The Right of Israel to Annex the West Bank and Beyond. And being a very, very staunch defender of Israel and of Jewish civilization, I had written extensively about Israel and what I call the moral and ethical superiority of Jewish civilization. I had made no bones about that. I published this article on Israel's right, Prime Minister Netanyahu's right to annex the West Bank, and furthermore went on to talk about the Palestinian people as an invented people who before 1964 had not really existed and who really had no right to Judea and Samaria, and that they were really war refugees living on Israeli land. Well, to cut a very, very long story short, all hell broke loose across DePaul campus. The Students for Justice in Palestine overtook a number of buildings, distributed thousands of leaflets. I received many death threats. But the most egregious thing that really happened to me was that against the wishes of the university president, faculty council took it upon themselves to, in an illegal way, violating the university handbook, to censure me. And I was conducted to, I was asked to attend a racial sensitivity workshop, which I steadfastly refused to do. There was a boycott led by faculty and by students against all my classes, which I'm still undergoing. And there were calls to have me fired, dismissed from my job. And the death threats continued. I was called a genocidal racist, war criminal, an advocate of ethnic cleansing, and subjected to several smear campaigns. No, I am a very, very thick-skinned person. I am a tough cookie, and I am stoic by nature, and one does not really cross me lightly without bearing severe repercussions. So I hired a very, shall I say, pit bull dog team of lawyers and engaged in a lawsuit against my university for defamatory claims, among other things. And I did not attend the racial sensitivity workshop. I adhered to none of the demands that were met. In fact, I continued to write my articles, and I wrote a letter to Attorney General William Barr asking him to remove that thuggish and warlike union called the Students for Justice in Palestine, which is a surrogate for Hamas, financed by the AMP, to have them, all 200 chapters, removed from all campuses in America, actually named the university administrative bodies that were behind the students on campus by name in print. I continue to write my articles. I continue to appear on Tucker Carlson, on Fox and Friends, and on various media outlets. So I want to reiterate what Professor Katz said, that one does not capitulate 1 inch to the adversary. One does not apologize. One does not offer any kind of appeasement to one's adversaries when one knows that one has not in any way committed an egregious act or violated anyone's individual rights. What one is doing is exercising one's First Amendment rights and doing it in, I think, a quite measured and quite principled manner. I will save for the discussion some of the remedies that I have. I think part of, because I know that this is going to come up, and Kimberly, you're going to talk about this quite extensively later on. I have very strong feelings about, I have lobbied on Capitol Hill about defunding or institutions of higher learning. I've done extensive research because I'm writing a book on higher education, on the extent to which I think our humanities and social science departments have become national security threats and ideological terror sites because they turn our students into enemies of the state, hatred of America, hatred of capitalism, hatred of reason. And furthermore, that alumni should be defunding some of these universities after having conducted a thorough investigation of the sort of education that their children are receiving, and to sort of take students out of the business of governorship. This business of shared governance, rather, one should say, does not belong in the hands of students. So I will probably end it there and just say that, you know, the boycotts against me continue. I've lost, like Professor Katz, I've lost all of my friends. I think I have 2 professors or 3 professors after having taught at the university for 20 years who are willing to speak to me. There is no one in my department whom I would consider a friend anymore. I had several friends there. People have irrevocably broken with me. It's fine. I'm very, very non-sentimental by nature, and even more non-sentimental in the professional world, and have a long staying power. So I'm willing to fight this to the bitter end, and I'm willing to write even more controversial articles, and to be to be both a scholar and to be an intellectual provocateur, and to invite them to actually dare them to threaten me with any more of their cancellations. So I shall end there.
Thank you so much, Professor Hill. And so lastly, I would like to introduce my boss, who is the president of the Legal Insurrection Foundation, also the publisher of the Legal Insurrection site. Professor Jacobson, William A. Jacobson, is a clinical professor of law and director of Securities Law Clinic at Cornell Law School. He's a 1981 graduate of Hamilton College and 1984 graduate of Harvard Law School. And prior to joining the Cornell Law faculty in 2007, Professor Jacobson practiced law in New York City from 1985 to 1993 and Providence, Rhode Island from 1994 to 2006. And you can find a lot more out about him on Cornell's website and on the Legal Insurrection blog as well. Professor Jacobson is probably, I believe, the most recent victim of a cancellation attempt, having gone through that just a couple months ago. And so I would like to introduce you to Professor Jacobson, who's going to share a little bit about what he dealt with.
Thank you, Kimberly. I'd like to start by thanking Kimberly for helping put this all together. It's a lot of work. I'm also going to give a shout out to Ellen Carmichael Guggenberger, who does publicity for us and helped us tremendously with this. I think she's watching, but she's really great. Also, it's great to reconnect with Robert. We've known each other for probably a decade, not all the 17 years he's been at FIRE, but when I first met him, it was a relatively small outfit, and I cannot say enough good things about that organization. And all of you should be supporting the FIRE. They really are on the front lines, and they're the first people that people in trouble turn to, and they're really always there. Jason and Joshua, I don't know before this, but I've read about what they've gone through, and they gave me a lot of inspiration for standing up for what they believed in. I will give you the 2-minute version of what happened to me. Many of you probably know it, but some of you may not. The 2-minute version is that I joined Cornell in 2007, started Legal Insurrection website in October 2008. Was a Tea Party conservative website. For the next 4 to 5 years, was a steady stream of attempts to get me fired, threats, harassment of other faculty, but it always came from outside the university. It was never inside the university. And the dean of the law school at the time always backed me up, even though at that time I had no job protection whatsoever. So in early June of this year, I wrote 2 blog posts highly critical of the Black Lives Matter movement. They were topics I'd researched before. I've covered the movement since its inception with the Trayvon Martin case and the Michael Brown shooting. And we've written dozens of posts over the years. So I was very, very familiar with it. And I wrote 2 posts, one saying that the Michael Brown narrative of hands up, don't shoot is false. It's a completely false, fabricated narrative. And the other thing was I was critical of the founding and the activists who were leading the movement, that they did not, and the rioting and the looting, that they did not have the country's interest in mind, and that they were seeking to tear down the country, not build it up. And of course, I think the last 3 months have completely vindicated me on that point. But what happened is people pretty much lost their minds. Now it came from within the building, and it came from within the Cornell community, whereas before that it had always been outside. So alumni organized a campaign, an email campaign, recent alumni, all within the last 10 years, or almost all within the last 10 years, an online petition to get me fired. 21 of my colleagues signed a letter denouncing me. Some of them I'd worked with for a decade. Some of them I considered friends. Not a single one of them approached me before the letter was published in the Cornell Sun. And although it didn't use my name, it was about me, and people within the building were told it was about me. I was denounced by the dean of the law school, and who said I would not be fired because I had job protection. It's not technically tenure, but it's something similar for clinical faculty, and because I had academic freedom, but I was denounced. And I was also, 15 student groups announced a boycott of my course and called upon all other students to boycott my course. By the way, the boycott failed. My course was oversubscribed. And that's because I have a lot of student support within the building. And throughout this, one of the things that really helped get me through it was not just hundreds and hundreds of emails from around the country once I went public with it, but a lot of emails from students who said that don't think these people speak for everybody, that you have a lot of support within the building. Just everybody is afraid to say anything. They don't want to become a target the way you have. And I think that's one of the big takeaways from what we call cancel culture, is that everybody who's on this panel has survived because we had job protection, whether tenure or something reasonably equivalent to tenure. But the damage from cancel culture is not to the people who are able to survive, who have a platform or job protection. It's to everybody else who doesn't have those benefits and those protections. They are scared into silence. And that's really one of the big takeaways. The other thing about cancel culture is one of the big pushbacks that I received was, well, you just don't like being criticized. And I think Kimberly went over some of the factors that cancel culture is not about criticism. In fact, I offered to publicly debate at the law school a representative of these student groups and a faculty member of their choice. So it wouldn't be me against a student, it'd be me against the students organizing the boycott of my course, and it would be me against whoever in the faculty, maybe one of the 21 people who signed a letter against me. Let's debate it. Let's put it on. Let's live stream it. That was rejected. So this is not about criticism. Anybody who knows our website, I receive criticism just about every day. I've received what I guess would loosely be called hate mail, nasty grams. I don't pick up my office phone, haven't picked up my office phone in 8 years because you never know who's there. So I can take criticism, but this is not criticism. This is a power play. And what we're seeing go on campuses and in the culture more broadly is an exercise of power to prevent open debate of ideas. So none of this is about debate. That's all I'll say for now. I've written a lot in the past about the problem. A couple of other points I want to make is that cancel culture is really a symptom, in my mind, of a deeper problem within the universities, a uniformity of ideological viewpoint, which has created what I consider to be an academic death spiral, which is creating a lot of pushback, where you increasingly have only one acceptable viewpoint on campus. Increasingly, only people who share that viewpoint are hired, and that is creating what I consider to be a death spiral. And it's a death spiral because now you're seeing pushback in the broader culture, demands to defund public universities, demands to, in fact, there's legislation just recently proposed by Senator Tom Cotton to impose requirements on universities who receive federal funding that they take steps to create an open campus culture and open debate. So you're going to see the government and the political process inserting itself into the university system because it has become so bad. So I view cancel culture as a symptom. And when we talk about stopping cancel culture, in my mind, an analogy is we have a sick patient, maybe a deathly sick patient, but we have to stop the bleeding before we can address the underlying issues, which are many and are not curable, certainly not in this call and maybe not in this decade. But before you do that, you have to deal with the symptom of cancel culture, which is sacrificing a lot of lives, damaging a lot of people. A lot of people have been fired, a lot of people have lost their jobs, and a lot of people are scared to death about speaking their opinion, even away from campus. And I think it's going to get worse. There was a mention made of anti-racist curriculum that's being imposed. Anti-racism is not, and we don't have time to get into it too deeply now, anti-racism is a term of art, and it does not mean not racist. In fact, it's just the opposite. The author of the book, which is suggested reading at Cornell and is being taught on many campuses, How to Be Anti-Racist, specifically advocates for current discrimination to remedy past discrimination. And that's getting pushed down, and I've received a lot of emails from people who are upset that this is happening. I'll conclude by talking about what do I think the remedy is short-term for cancel culture. And I think part of the remedy is responsible university administration, which unfortunately is lacking in many instances. Unfortunately, a lot of presidents and deans, et cetera, think the answer when a professor or a student or anybody is under attack is to say, well, I'm not going to fire that person, but then you denounce the person. And when you do that, that happened at Cornell. The president of the university did that with regard to a chemistry professor who had some controversial tweets about a police incident in Buffalo. And there was a change.org petition, and there were student email campaigns, and there were auto email templates set up flooding the university. And that the president, who I think is well-intentioned, took the out that many university presidents take, which is they say, okay, well, this professor can't be fired because he has tenure and we support academic freedom and we support free speech, but we're now going to denounce that person. And that's what happened to that chemistry professor. The concept being that the university as an institution is entitled to express its view just like any person. And that's essentially what happened to me at Cornell Law School, with the dean issuing a similar condemnation that he's not going to be fired because he has academic freedom and job protection, but now we denounce him. And when a president or a dean does that, it sets a limit of what is acceptable speech. It sends a message to all of the people who do not have that protection that have to affirm that institutional decision and that institutional opinion, or they may get fired. When you say, we're not going to fire him because he has job protection, well, that's telling everybody who doesn't have job protection that they are at risk. I'll conclude. Somebody sent it to me, and I just saw it. Scalia Law School at George Mason University faculty I think it was 2 days ago, passed a resolution, I'm not sure what the right word for it is, on a commitment to open dialogue and debate. And I think it really succinctly summarizes what the problem is, and I'll just read you an excerpt from it. Recently, it has become far too common for colleges and universities to impose sanctions on faculty members whose research or public statements do not conform to the reigning climate of approved opinion. As pressures for conformity increase throughout our society, it is even becoming dangerous to show insufficient enthusiasm for certain causes and beliefs. This faculty has always rejected the imposition of any political or ideological orthodoxy by us or on us. We recognize no hierarchy of authority in the world of ideas. The faculty strongly opposes efforts, whether within our community or from outside, to pressure us or the school's administration to engage in the repression of unpopular opinions, whether we agree with those opinions or not. And so that, I think, is a very strong affirmation by the faculty there, and it really is what people should be aspiring to. And I'd love to see Cornell's various faculties pass something similar so that we're not establishing what was called a hierarchy of accepted opinions.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Jacobson. And again, thank you to our entire panel. So we do have a couple questions meant to facilitate this discussion a little bit further that I'm going to ask the panel before we start taking questions from those of you in attendance. And so this one, I think, let's see, where should we start? Because this is a question I think that just about everyone in attendance does have. I have actually seen it mirrored in the comments. How can parents be involved in the fight against cancel culture in higher education? And I think let's start with Robert on this one. And then after that, if you have something to add, please jump in and do so.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. I've only fairly recently realized just how involved parents have become in college students' lives. I know that they will, I talked to one, actually a dean of diversity at a major school, and she said people are calling her and parents are calling her and yelling at her about random things. Also the student life people. My own sort of belief as a parent should largely butt out, but I think that ship has sailed. I mean, these are adults. I mean, these are 18-year-old, they're scholars, they're adults. That said, since they're not, you know, I think remaining silent when you see things like this is obviously a bad idea. You know that people who are demanding censorship or demanding that people with you know, your kids' views or, you know, other kids' views that you care about are going to have their say. I don't think it's wrong to send a polite email. You know, a lot of the reason cancel culture is so successful is because it creates a perception around university administrators and anybody who's exposed to social media that the whole world is on them, when really it might be a few dozen people. And so some pushback for that is really very important. You know, and just to sort of balance that out. I think psychologically, we're not prepared to see Twitter as not, you know, how people are in real life, or, you know, a big bunch of forum emails is not how people are in real life. And so I think parents should do that. I think they need to be very, you know, they get calls for donations all the time because goodness knows college is insufficiently expensive now. You know, bringing that up when they call you for your donations, they're supposed to, those students are almost always told to write down what you say if you don't want to give. So when Duke quit calling me after a while, but when Duke used to call me, you know, and my parents, they would tell them what they thought, and the students would be like, "Oh, really? I didn't know that," and that sort of thing. So I think just making your voice heard in a polite way is good. Yes, I understand, you know, maybe people who are hollering for someone's head aren't going to be polite. I don't think, though, that means that people who are calling for hearing all opinions should do that. I think it does have more power sounding reasonable. And also, you know, considering donations, I mean, parents, if you want to, we talked a little bit about defunding or whatever universities, but I think this is a really hard slog, but alumni really need to hold universities accountable and not give them huge amounts of money. Universities are effectively, particularly with wealthier alumni who donate, are effectively blackmailing those alumni by implying in not so many words that if they were to cut off, and I've talked to these folks, I've asked them, why do you keep giving to this university? And they'll say, you know, basically, if I stop giving, they're not going to let my kids in. And so they've really got, if you went to Harvard, you're a fancy, you know, New Yorker or something, not to cast aspersions. You want your kid to be able to do that. You certainly don't want them, you know, to be on the blacklist at Harvard, right? And that is the sort of thing that can happen. You know, I don't know how often they actually do it, but as long as universities hold these keys to, you know, success and respectability and credentials, they're going to have a huge amount of leverage. But nevertheless, alumni and parents need to, you know, dial that back and stop supporting people who are undermining their own kids' ability to express themselves.
If I can just jump in here, I think I agree partially with Robert, but I think this problem of cancel culture is actually systemic. More systemic than, and I don't use the word systemic quite often because I'm aware of the meaning of it. I think it's actually more systemic. Look, most of the professors in the humanities are not conservative professors. They are left-wing cultural Marxists. Most of the professoriate in America are cultural Marxists who, and I've been a professor for 24 years. I've taught at 2 Ivy Leagues, from the cornfields of poor Indiana students to Black students in East St. Louis to now DePaul University for 20 years. And I've taught at 1 European university for a year. So I've been around the block. And I think in America, this issue of cancellation is quite systemic. And most of the professoriate, they hate America. They hate capitalism. They hate conservative viewpoints. They hate, they're now run by postmodernists, except for the analytic philosophers. But in the history departments, the literature departments, the philosophy departments, they are postmodern nihilists, where now grammar is racist, reason is a construct of white imperialist European men who want to marginalize and disenfranchise oppressed people. The canon itself is hegemonic and racist. These are systemic problems. And I think that when you are paying $38,000, as students are paying at DePaul, $38,000 to $40,000 a year, upwards to $150,000 a year at other universities, parents have to take responsibility. I am shocked. This is where I disagree with Robert. I'm actually quite shocked at the extent to which parents are not involved with the learning domains of their children's lives. What they're really, I've gotten more calls from parents who say, why did you give my child a B- or a B+ on an A? They're not really concerned with the content. What they're concerned with is upward social mobility and how that A ratifies itself in terms of getting a job. So I think that parents need to be less polite, less concerned with grave grubbing, and more concerned with how these institutions, especially the social sciences and humanities, have turned into indoctrination cells where students actually are graded down. This is not a myth. This is becoming increasingly common. If you hold conservative viewpoints in the humanities and the social sciences, and especially if you are, and I can say this as a person of color who teach at a predominantly white university, especially if you're like a white male who holds a conservative viewpoint and you raise your hand, at many universities, you're instructed to not call on that person because they're privileged and they're exercising their white privilege, and you will be graded down if you hold a conservative viewpoint. There's something fundamentally wrong, nefarious about that position. Parents should be angry. They should be defunding those, leading an effort to defund those universities, alumni here, and getting more involved with the manner and the methodology that these professors are leading their classes, because they're not teaching these kids critical thinking skills anymore. They're conducting their classes as indoctrination centers.
Could I reiterate the importance here of the Chicago principles? So these matter and can matter for parents as well. So if your child is thinking of attending a college or university, you should see whether that college or university is one of the 75 that has endorsed or formally adopted these principles. And if your child wants to go there and it's not one of those institutions, you might write to the institution and say, okay, why have you not? Or conversely, maybe your child wants to attend or is attending a place that has signed on to these principles, but maybe you think that the principles aren't in fact fully being respected. Then say something about that as well. I think these are incredibly important. I think, and Robert Shibley can talk about this much better than I can, but I think these principles, however imperfectly they may be, however imperfectly they may work, are about as important as anything that we have.
Thank you so much. Professor Jacobson, do you have anything to add to that before we move on?
The only thing I would say is this is a question that's often posed to me by parents who self-identify as conservative politically. And what I say is spend as much time learning about the culture on the campus as you do learning about the dining hall and the sports facilities and the extracurricular activities. Parents will spend enormous time looking into those things and spend zero time looking into what the intellectual life is like on campus. And I think that would be the most constructive role in my mind, that parents, it's the decision whether to go there is the point in time the parents can have the most input. Once the students are there, it's a lot harder.
Okay, thank you. So let's see, next we're going to go to, we'll just kind of dig right into it. Should higher education be saved at all? I think that's a question a lot of people are currently grappling with, as whether or not to even bother. I mean, is this going to explode? I know this is a conversation my husband and I have had multiple times because our kids are small. Will there be higher education left, and what will that look like in 10, 15, 18 years from now? So yes, we'll start with Professor Katz for this one.
That's a very hard one for me. It's a very hard one for me because unlike everybody else on the panel, everything that has just happened is very new to me. I was very well liked, I think it's fair to say, about 10 weeks ago. And boy, am I not liked now. So my father is a retired professor at an Ivy League institution in a different field. I grew up in an academic environment. I always wanted to be a professor. I have had a charmed and extraordinarily privileged life, and I have loved being in the academy until really very recently. So it's difficult for me not to hold out hope. But I fully recognize that I'm saying this as somebody who could not imagine just a few months ago that he would be appearing on this panel. So I'd rather hear what other people have to say about that.
Thank you.
Well, I guess that's a question I know one of our readers posted in the comments section, and I think other people are posting similar things. Is it worth saving? Well, I take a different view of it, is that higher education is going to continue in some form. Certainly the well-endowed elite universities are going to continue to be well-endowed and elite. Cornell was around 100+ years before I came to this earth, and it'll be around for 100+ years. And so I don't think it's really a question of whether it will survive, whether it can be rescued, but what form it's going to take. What are there going to be improvements? And I think that's really where the fight is. And a lot of alumni I hear all the time ask, should I donate? Should I not donate? And that's really their decision. But the fact of the matter is that are your donations just going to perpetuate a bad situation, or are they going to actually improve the situation? And you've got to consider that. So higher ed's going to be around. I think the best efforts are towards pushing it in a more positive direction. Those best efforts are not necessarily, platitudes and flowery statements from administrators. I have no illusions about that. But I think the question, should it be saved, is really an emotional reaction. And believe me, I get that feeling. But it's going to be around, and I think the question is what it's going to look like. Is it going to continue to get worse, or is it going to get better?
Can I just briefly answer that? I will just say that as I interpret the question, higher education as a liberal arts form of education to a broad swath or the mass of people is over. When Rutgers University can declare something like grammar's racist, when 50% of universities, as far as I can recall, faculty have been issued call to decolonize their syllabus. And today, Cambridge University issued a notice that its English department would be teaching Kanye West, the poetry of Kanye West and Jay-Z, alongside the poetry of Shakespeare and other esteemed poets. Just take decolonizing the syllabus, for example, and what that means. It means ridding the canonical syllabi of historical figures. Higher education, in some sense, when you declare grammar's racist, it's over. So I agree with, I agree that in some sense, higher education is going to be the elite privilege. We're going to see a gilded system where higher education is going to be the elite privilege of a very few cadre of individuals. But it's already lost for the masses of people. The sort of system that Dewey had in mind, it's over, right? When we're teaching, when we're equating as moral equivalence, literary equivalence, linguistic equivalence, the foul-mouthing invectives of Jay-Z alongside Shakespeare, we're dead, we're done, we're over. I think there's no nice and proper way of saying it. It's just repugnant and it's done. We're done. The question is how to save a particular type of higher education for those small band of students who are willing to be the recipients of it. Because the rest of individuals out there, as far as I'm concerned, are just merely social ballasts who don't want to think. And those who don't want to think don't really matter in this issue. They've never forged civilization ahead. Civilization has always been forged by a small minority of people and the unthinking brutes and thugs who form cancel culture, those who swarm our campuses and kill free speech and want to decolonize the syllabi. Those are social ballasts, and they're going down with higher education.
I just want to add, I think we have, I think I agree that there is going to be some form of higher education that continues regardless. Obviously, there are some universities that are probably unkillable, like Harvard and Yale and Stanford, just because of money. But I think we shouldn't overlook the amount of corruption that in the whole system that has resulted from the fact that it's effectively a cartel with unlimited funding from the government as they continue to increase the amount of money they're willing to put into the system. And also, we've put them in charge, we've put folks in charge of self-regulating all the way from the accreditors on down. The inmates are in charge of the asylum. One of the difficulties, though, is that there's really no good replacement for these particular inmates, because you would want, at least in terms of it being faculty, they are, they're the people who are trained and who are educators, et cetera. And so I think it's difficult to propose an alternative to that that, couldn't potentially be worse. At the same time, though, I think, the breaking up of the cartel, there being more competition in terms of being able to issue credentials. I know Google is doing something in that direction right now. I think is going to be very important. I think what we're seeing right now is actually, this real bubble effect that's been driven, really to the nth degree. So while I personally, despair from time to time about what can be done with it and whether or not a lot of universities just need to vanish, in order for it to happen. I think that simply turning down the perverse incentives would start to make a difference, possibly sooner than folks think.
Okay, great. So my next question comes from the comment section. There've been quite a few people that have asked this, and it's actually looking beyond higher education. There are several parents who are concerned that their kids might be canceled or at least blacklisted post higher education, simply for the fact that they went to maybe a more conservative institution like a Hillsdale College or like BYU or Texas A&M University, which is where I went, which usually are competing for the most conservative college in the country by certain metrics. But they're concerned that their kids may be canceled or blacklisted for attending one of those colleges or even for having conservative student group activity on their resume. Can anyone speak to that, or would anyone like to comment on that?
I'll comment on that because over the years, we've had a number of students write for us, and I have the same conversation with them if they do anything political for us, that, the internet is forever. And, there is a culture against conservatives at a lot of companies, and they're going to Google you, and you'll never know why you never got not just the job, why you never even got a call about it. And so you just have to understand that if you're going to come out as conservative on campus, you're going to have potential consequences. And I often encourage them to speak to their parents about it. Most of the time they get back to me and say, I'm still going to do it, but there have been occasions where they say they won't. So I think that student activity, association, guilt by association is a real problem. And what we've written a lot about it, legal insurrection, and I've talked about it at some of our events, is the migration of campus culture into the more general culture. That the worst attributes of campus culture are now in the more general culture. And the people a generation of students who were raised to believe the single greatest right you have is the right to be free from being upset. And anything that somebody says that upsets you is therefore hate speech, and you're entitled to suppress. That generation now works at Twitter and YouTube and Google and Facebook and makes the decisions as to which posts get taken down and which don't. And they're the hiring committees, they're in human resources departments. And so it's a real problem. I don't have an easy answer or solution. All I would say is think it through. Think what the possible consequences could be, because they're real.
So, Kimberly, somebody wrote, I was just reading the notes here, that one of the persons in the audience said, please stick to the facts and not your opinions. So I'm going to try, I thought I was doing that, and I don't know to whom it was addressed, but I'm going to try to stick to the facts here, having taught for 24 years and having seen with the degradation of literacy skills, math skills, all sorts of competency skills going down the drain. When you have something like grammar being called racist and being replaced by something called critical grammar. Now, look, I don't believe in mincing words, and I'm not politically correct. So we know what critical grammar is. It's something like Ebonics, it's something like Black English, it's something like alternative English. It's nothing but a set of language tools that's going to turn students into grunting farm animals, right? So I would say to those individuals who are concerned about sounding or having concerns about going to conservative college, that this is the global world. If you're going to a Hillsdale, if you're going to a Pepperdine, and if you're going to university, that is not going to capitulate to this kind of nonsense like critical grammar is racist and teaching critical grammar, you're going to emerge with some pretty profound and robust skills. You're going to emerge as a critical thinker. You're going to emerge as a pretty good interlocutor with your fellow compatriot. You're going to emerge with a kind of articulacy and fluency in language and in thinking that will make you a competitor in the global marketplace. You cannot cheat and you cannot fake reality. Ultimately, reality wins. And so this is not in competition with the point that was just made before. It's just that it's going to be probably a hard and long road. But I think that such students in the end will win out because they will have been the recipients of a much superior form of education, an education that will not have capitulated to cancel culture and all the sort of chicanery that goes with it. So I'll just leave it at that.
I mean, one of the other questions, though, is what happens if you don't go to Hillsdale or Grove City College? And I, like Professor Jacobson, I don't have a clear view on how you're supposed to stop yourself from being canceled in advance. But what I can say is that what holds for faculty and staff also holds for students. Namely, you do not want to be alone. So you want, when you arrive on campus, to find other people who either more or less think like you or are perfectly tolerant of a wide range of opinions. And then all of you should band together and do things like write letters or write op-ed pieces or complain the way you want, but not as lone people, as a group. And anytime an outside organization sees that there's a group of people, it's going to matter a whole lot more than if you're on your own. So try that.
Thank you. See, where did this other question go, which I thought was actually a fantastic question too. Someone who is an anonymous attendee asked the following: it's one thing for a tenured professor to stand up, as you all have done, and which I admire, but what hope does an assistant professor, or worse, an adjunct lecturer, have in a similar situation? So maybe Professor Katz, since you're up, you can speak to that.
Well, I'm not nodding because I have an answer. I'm nodding because this is a very, very real question. So I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal, and one of the letters that a reader published a few days later more or less asked that question and said, well, it's all very well and good. It's great that he wasn't canceled, Katz, but hey, what would have happened if he hadn't had some fancy chair? I like to think, and I'm sorry to keep beating this horse, but I like to think that if you're at an institution that has adopted the Chicago principles, that at least in the short run, you could probably get away with speaking your mind. That said, and I'm going to bet that Professor Hill is going to disagree with me on this, but that's good. That said, I think I would advise a certain kind of circumspection. So I'm very unhappy with some of my senior colleagues, very, very senior colleagues, who have written to me and said, we support you, but we can't say anything. But I have received some really lovely messages from junior colleagues too, who have said more the same thing, and my heart actually goes out to them. So quite honestly, on balance, I would say it's probably better to keep quiet until you're relatively safe. I'm not happy about saying that, and I don't think I would have said that a few years ago, but I feel like saying that now at the end of August 2020. I hope a year from now I won't say it. I hope the world will have changed, but right now I would advise circumspection.
I just want to add, I think the fact that I think one of the weird things about tenure is that it is actually, while it's important and it protects a lot of people, I think it's led to a belief that, you know, even if it's not explicit, is still out there, that unless you have tenure, you don't have academic freedom. Academic freedom itself shouldn't be restricted to people who have tenure. There is absolutely no reason for it. You know, university policies almost never make any kind of distinction in terms of academic freedom, and certainly the AAUP's historical you know, documents, as well as the academic freedom commitments that the accreditors talk about, aren't restricted to tenured faculty. So the fact is, if tenure is the thing that's protecting your academic freedom, the system is already broken down. And that actually could be, I think there are probably, you know, accreditors, possibly even the government in its, you know, in its enterprise as sort of accrediting the accreditors, could probably do more to ensure that the academic freedom promises that universities make are actually being extended to non-tenure faculty and adjunct faculty. Does that mean they're not going to use that as an excuse to deny you tenure down the road? No, probably not. But, you know, I think in the short term, right now, I think universities feel very free to fire people who don't have any, you know, those official contractual protections in their own individual contract. But that is not what they're supposed to be doing. That's a corruption, and it needs to be cracked down on. There really does need to be a change on that sooner rather than later.
Well, I want to correct the misconception here, because I mean, the idea that only tenured faculty members speak out when they have tenure is mistaken. I went through a very nasty, vicious tenure battle about 14 years ago because of my viewpoints. So I was writing editorials and I was writing things that were outside of the orthodoxy of left-wing academic speak, and I faced a nasty tenure battle. I would say to those adjuncts and those junior professors, I agree with Professor Katz. You must have the courage of your convictions, and not everybody's a firebrand such as myself and other junior professors. If you are not willing to face a fight and put up a vicious fight such as I did, and fight for your tenure, and make it known that you're not somebody that can be crossed, then the best thing is to keep your mouth shut and to keep quiet until you do have tenure. But there are junior professors who I know personally who will have no truck with being silenced, and who are quite courageous and will go and put their. One thing I want to say is that if you're a junior professor and you're an adjunct, institutions do not like to be shamed. They do not like to be subjected to moral approbation. Blog, write to magazines, go to networks and shame these institutions and dare them to fire you. Because I have found with my experience with these institutions that they don't like to have a bad reputation. They really don't like to have their names in the papers or online, or worse, in TV media outlets. So if you have that sort of orientation, if you have that sort of spine, that steel to your spine, and you're a junior professor, and you want to have the courage of your convictions, and you're willing to face the music, then take your message to the media if you're being threatened by your university, and be willing to face the consequences, because the consequences will be dire.
All right, thank you. This question comes from Walter, and Walter asks, regarding Senator Cotton's call to make universities consent to some sort of free speech agreement, would you go even further and demand that taxpayer-funded institutions have to adhere to the U.S. Constitution in all its shapes and forms? Let's see, I guess, Professor Jacobson, do you want to take this one first?
I think that's where this is heading. A lot will depend on what happens in the November election, but if Trump is reelected, I think there is such a backlash building that some sort of federal legislation, obviously that will depend who controls the House and the Senate, there is such anger that I think many people on university campuses are oblivious to, building in this country at this cancel culture and at academia, that I think there's going to be some sort of governmental intervention. And it might be tying federal funding to achieving certain goals. It might be that for private institutions, they will be required to adhere to the constitutional protections that would apply on public universities, which means the First Amendment applies in full. And so I think something like that's going to happen. I think universities will fight it. They probably have very well-paid lobbyists who will fight it. But I think that's where it's going. And I am not very optimistic about the university system being able to cure itself on its own. I think only outside pressure is going to do that. And I think I think something like that is probably a good thing. And I think it's certainly within the federal government's power to do that. The Supreme Court case upheld the so-called Solomon Amendment many years ago, where the federal government threatened to passed an amendment to the law that would withhold federal funding from any university that did not allow military recruiters equal treatment to other hiring recruiters on campus. Harvard Law School refused to allow the military to recruit on campus because, at least at that point in time, the military had the don't ask, don't tell policy. And the federal government said, fine, we are going to pull funding from all of Harvard University, and which is in the hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe more per year. And it went up to the Supreme Court. It was upheld by the Supreme Court that the federal government can insist on that as a precondition to its providing funds. And once that was decided, we found out the price of Harvard Law School's principals because they quickly folded and allowed the military on campus. So their principles protecting gay students had a price, and it was not a price they were willing to pay. And so I think that could happen. I think it probably will happen depending on what happens in the election. And I think that just as their campuses, I assure you, in 2016, had no clue whatsoever that there were actually people out there who supported Donald Trump. And that's why at Cornell you had crying circles, and you had things like that. And I think people on universities, they are so used to being in complete control, and they are so used to denouncing people on campus. I don't think they have a clue what's going on in this country and the backlash that's building. So I think that's going to happen.
Speaking as someone, as an independent conservative, not a Republican, who has lobbied on Capitol Hill in 2018 with senators and congressmen and their staff, I was shocked at the extent to which so few of them knew about what was going on in terms of cancel culture and, more importantly, the defiance of free speech, the First Amendment. I think if you follow, you just have to follow the money and hold people accountable, and this nonsense is going to stop. I think something like the fairness doctrine that we had in the airwaves should be applied in the educational system, fairness doctrine in education, that there should be something like ideological balance and diversity. And I don't see why parents should be financing, especially in the public, well, private universities receive federal funds, but especially in the public universities, why parents should be funding literally their own destroyers. That is, funding values or teachings that are inimical to their own values when there is no platform for contestation or rejoinders, that is critical thinking skills that equip their children to rebut and to offer counterfactuals. So I think something like this is going to happen. I agree with Professor Jacobson that these universities are not used to, they're used to running their own fiefdoms. But I think it's absolutely inevitable.
I want to say, I don't think that it's practical or a good idea to have some sort of fairness doctrine applied by the federal government here. I think it would be the most ham-handed thing you could imagine, particularly if you've dealt with the federal government and the sort of people who are sort of the permanent class there. Their idea of two sides can be pretty shocking. And so I think that imports a lot of the problem. But I do think that we are going to see sooner rather than later, and I'm talking probably in the next couple of years, particularly if President Trump is reelected, more and more pressure using federal funding. You know, they've been taking the king shilling for a long time, and that comes with certain responsibilities. The government doesn't have to fund all of these universities in the way they do. We're already seeing that go forward some with the executive orders that have to do with research funding. I do agree very much with Professor Jacobson that and Professor Hill, that people in Washington and also people on campuses do not understand how absolutely livid average people are with this cancel culture stuff. I think, you hate to go purely by anecdotes, but I think those are two places that are very heavily within their own bubble. I know I've already used that metaphor, but I think even, the people who sort of have an inkling of how angry people are, when it comes to, they really feel like they've been betrayed, that this promise of America where they can say things freely, they really feel very betrayed by the fact that that's not happening. I think people in Washington and people in academia are already used to policing their speech all the time. The fact that you're applying this to every random plumber in America, and anybody who's, just your average, sort of white collar worker going to work, wants to send their kids to college, and they find this stuff happen. You could see a preference cascade on this, and I think you will probably in the next couple of years. I think that the Democrats will probably push back very hard on anything that happens there, but I would be very surprised if it's purely status quo on funding 2 years from now.
Okay, thank you so much. So I do have, I have one question, and then I have one that we'll just go through very quickly because I'd like to get everyone's thoughts on it. And then we'll wrap up because we're already sitting at 9:30 now. So the next question is about Oberlin College, which I know Professor Jacobson covered extensively at Legal Insurrection. And someone's asking, or I guess stating, that Oberlin College showed how many people can fight back and when. What lessons can we all learn from their triumph, and what tactics can we employ if a similar situation were to arise? And for those of you unfamiliar with Oberlin College and the situation there, I'll just give you the super fast quick notes version, and then Professor Jacobson can fill in the blanks there. There was a bakery, a very small bakery, that was accused of engaging in racism because they had the nerve to prosecute students for shoplifting. And there was an all-out campaign to essentially defund the bakery and to shut it down. And the family fought back, and so far have been successful in doing so. And so I'll toss that one to Professor Jacobson. Of course, if anyone has any thoughts to add to that. And then I have one more question for everyone before we wrap up.
I think a lot of people have taken the wrong, reached the wrong conclusions from the Gibson Bakery fighting back. It really is the exception, it's not the rule. My experience, and I was a litigator for 20 plus years before I joined Cornell, is that universities are some of the most vicious litigators known in the country. They will fight to the death to make sure that a young man falsely accused of sexual assault is kicked off campus. And Oberlin is fighting those battles in John Doe number 1 and John Doe number 2 cases, which we're following. And they're continuing to fight Gibson's Bakery. You can go through university after university, and they are some of the most litigious entities I've ever seen. They will fight bitterly. So it's a misconception that because Gibson's Bakery so far, and it's up on appeal, it may or may not hold up, that is a model to fight back. They happen to have one of the best contingency fee lawyers in Ohio representing them, someone who's had many such verdicts, but there are only so many of those lawyers to go around. There is a misconception perpetuated mostly by universities themselves that they have some sort of higher moral calling because they are in higher education. In fact, they are just businesses. They are just corporations. Their business happens to be higher education, but at the administrative level, they're just big corporations, and they will fight you tooth and nail. And so I don't think the Gibson's Bakery necessarily serves as a model.
Does anyone have anything they'd like to add? Okay. So the last question I have, which is a two-part question, and I'll start with Professor Katz, and I guess we can just work our way down, which is how bad is the problem of cancel culture on campus, and is something that Professor Jacobson touched on briefly, which is it worse now than it was before George Floyd's death? And the third part of that is, quickly, if you think that it's overrepresented on college campuses versus the rest of the world.
Right. Well, it's very hard to know. I would think at the majority of college and university campuses how much, how bad it is, because we don't at the moment have campuses, or rather, I don't. I mean, we're starting classes tomorrow. No undergraduates are here. No undergraduates have been here since March, essentially. And some graduate students are around, but the campus is a ghost town. So it's a very, very funny time, as we all know. And I think it's just very, very hard to know how to answer this, because all the things that are happening online, which in one way means there can't be protests or riots, or call them what you like, on campus. But on the other hand, you've got a lot of people who are disgruntled and sitting alone and getting agitated, and therefore doing things that perhaps they would not if they were actually in a more communal setting. So I'm punting on this question because I think the world environment at the moment makes it impossible, at least for me, to give a good answer to that. As for the third part, is it worse on colleges and university campuses than elsewhere? I don't know that I'm qualified to answer that. It looks to me as though it is generally worse, but of course, it's spreading to the wider world, as some of the other panelists had mentioned, and it's spreading, I think it's fair to say, from the universities. But I think I'd better let people who know the answers to these questions better than I do answer them.
Thank you.
I mean, I can say, like I said in my intro, numbers wise, I mean, it's definitely the worst it's been, in terms of what's coming fire's direction. I think that, we know that issues of race are the most difficult thing to talk about on college campuses, the thing you're most likely to get in trouble for. And because, I mean, we've really had such a summer of this, it is, I mean, it's been turned up to the nth degree. Also, just, the sheer numbers of reports that fire is seeing suggests, and we only get the ones really that have to do with college campuses. I have a hard time believing that per capita wise, it's probably not worst on college campuses than it is either in high schools, where it's still a real thing. Keep in mind, they're going after high school students as well. And just, the sheer number of people, employed outside of the universities. I suspect it probably is. I'd be very surprised if it weren't worst off in the college and university milieu.
Professor Hill, do you have anything to add to that?
You're muted.
As Professor Katz said, we haven't been on campus since March. I think cancel culture has been in ascendancy since I was an undergraduate in the 1980s, when there was this thing about DWEMs, dead white males canceling all European figures from the canon. But I think having gone through graduate school and having been in America for the past 35 years and having been really in academia for the past 35 years and witnessing it, what I have seen as a contributing factor to the growth of cancel culture is something that's quite good, or commitment to what seems to be quite good on the surface at least, or commitment to diversity. And this commitment to the buzzword called equity. As we've become more committed to diversity, we've also made a category mistake. We've taken it upon ourselves to think that a commitment to diversity means that all divergent and all diverse opinions or viewpoints are morally equivalent or morally equal. And so the systems of appraisal, that there used to be the idea that there's one objective way or set of objective methods for adjudicating truth claims. Now we have diversity and a diverse body of students, and we take it that each of them have their own unique, there's a Latino, there's a feminist, there's a queer, there's a Black way of validating what we call epistemology of validating viewpoints. And if you don't agree with my viewpoint as a gay person, as a Black person, as a feminist, as a Latinx, then you're just a bad, rotten person, right? So I think that's contributed to the rise of cancel culture, as we've been committed to more diversity, paradoxically. The second part of the question as to whether or not it's worse in the universities or the outside culture, I think it starts in the universities. I think the universities are the transmission belt of culture. I think it starts with the professors who convey these ideas, run these indoctrination centers, these ideological terror sites, who cut down the critical thinking skills, cut off the critical thinking skills of their students. The administrative bodies, and I'm talking about the deans and the provosts and the plethora of associate provosts and executive provosts and executive deans, who themselves endorse, ratify the student demands. And when the students storm into their offices, instead of calling the police and having them kicked out and arrested, acquiesce and accede to their demands. It starts in the universities and then it spreads like wildfire into the corporations, because the students themselves take these ideas into the corporate and the boardrooms, and more importantly, into the media.
Professor Jacobson?
Well, I guess the question is it worse now? Yes, I think it is worse now. I think just my example is a good example of how I can't imagine this having happened a year ago to me. And the best evidence of that is I wrote exactly the same things about the Black Lives Matter movement a year ago and 4 years ago. And I followed the Michael Brown case very closely. And I've written essentially the post that I wrote in early June about the Michael Brown fabrication was reminder, okay, this is fabricated, because I've written about it 2 or 3 times before. Nobody said anything 2 or 3 times before. So I do think we are in a time, not of hypersensitivity, but where people view this as an opportunity to exert their power over these institutions. And that's exactly what's going on. And so I think it is worse now. I think this has been weaponized. I think issues related to race, which have always been there, have now been weaponized for power purposes on university campuses. And there is essentially zero tolerance for divergent views on these issues. So yes, I do think it is worse now. I don't know where it's going to go. I think it's probably a good thing that we were not in session when this all happened, when I wrote my blog posts. Because I think, and all campuses were not in session, not because of the virus, but because it was essentially late May, early June. Most campuses had already finished for the year. I think you would have seen significant violence on campuses. I think you would have seen confrontations against professors, physical confrontations. I have no doubt about that. And so what was lacking in my case was institutional leadership that could have, and faculty leadership that, my situation could have gone a couple of different ways, but I know for a fact that faculty were coordinating with students on this, on going after me. And when I found that out, because someone shared documents with me, that's what led me to believe I needed to go public now. I didn't go public when the alumni letters started coming in. I didn't even go public when the faculty signed, 21 staff people, faculty signed their letter against me. It's when I found out, because there were some people of goodwill out there who shared things with me, that this was a coordinated effort, that I decided to go public. And I think that would never have happened a year ago. A year ago, I probably would have gotten a call from people I've worked with for 10 years saying, look, some people are upset with some things you wrote. Maybe we should set up a phone call or a meeting. Maybe we should talk it through. Maybe you need to explain better what you meant by this or by that. None of that happened. It was a mad rush to see who could denounce their neighbor or their colleague first. You know, I know we're getting near the end here, but I studied the Soviet Union in college. I studied in the Soviet Union in Moscow in 1980 during the Cold War. And I understand revolutionary movements and neighbors denouncing neighbors, colleagues, workers denouncing other workers is one of the hallmarks of a revolutionary movement. And that's essentially what cancel culture is. It's the denunciation of your colleagues and your neighbors and your friends in order to curry favor. So I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think it's going to get a lot worse if Joe Biden wins the election, because that will be viewed as a vote of confidence in what is going on. So stay tuned.
Okay, I want to thank everyone so much for joining us this evening, and especially our panelists too for taking time out to join us on a Sunday evening to discuss something that is so immeasurably important right now. And to everyone watching, I just want to encourage you. We hear from people all of the time. You know, Professor Jacobson gets so many emails, as do I. We get comments from our readers, and I'm sure that Robert, Joshua, and Jason can all speak to this as well. You're not alone. And I want you to be encouraged in that. You are not alone. I mean, this evening, before you, you have 3 gentlemen who refused to cave into the mob and to say, no, I disagree with you, and I don't have to agree with you, and that's okay. And they put everything on the line, their livelihoods, their careers, in order to do so because of their convictions. And I believe that you have the same conviction as well. You just have to find it within you to say no. But just know and be heartened and encouraged that you're not alone, and that just because people who agree with you are not as vocal as those in the mob does not mean that you're a minority in this. I mean, I think we'll see that down the road in November, but just be heartened and be encouraged, and know that you're not alone. Robert is a fantastic resource if you're dealing with anything specifically like this. And then, you know, I don't want to offer up without speaking to them, Professor Katz and Professor Hill. But I know Professor Jacobson routinely gets emails and calls from people dealing with similar things. But you have friends here, you have allies, and there are so many more people like you who are just as concerned as you are, and know that you have friends here. Okay. So, and with that, if y'all have anything further to add, you know how to contact us, and you can always find us at Legal Insurrection and in legalinsurrectionfoundation.org. We will be publishing this. This has been recorded. We'll be publishing it in a couple of days. And for those of you who registered, you'll receive the video as well if you care to watch it again for fun or to share or whatever you'd like to do with it. But again, thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and look forward to further programming. We'll definitely be exploring cancel culture in earnest in different venues, and maybe even beyond this. So look for that. Again, thank you so much, and y'all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.